قررت المحكمة الحكم على المدان صدام حسين المجيد بالإعدام شنقا حتى الموت.
And the whole scene was captured on video in some of surely the most compelling pictures ever seen. There's just a glimpse of the scaffold where he's about to die and that is news.
December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein, once the iron-fisted ruler of Iraq, walked quietly toward the gallows as he was about to be executed live on camera for his crimes against humanity. But his death isn't the worst on our list. Here are 10 times dictators got executed on camera.
The body of Saddam Hussein has been flown on board an American plane to his hometown of Tikrit. The former Iraqi president was hanged early on Saturday for crimes against humanity.
Saddam, as we said, dressed in this raincoat and black suit with his feet and hands tied, being taken from the execution room to the gallows.
December 30th, 2006. At Camp Justice near Baghdad, the final chapter of Saddam Hussein's brutal reign was about to close. The former Iraqi president, once feared across the Middle East, faced his destiny, execution by hanging for crimes against humanity. Saddam's story is one of ruthless power and devastating conflict. After decades ruling with an iron fist, his regime was toppled in 2003 by a US-led coalition. Driven largely by fear, he possessed weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism, claims later found untrue. But the scars of his reign were real: massacres, chemical attacks, and widespread oppression. The invasion was fueled by more than just Saddam's atrocities. The shock of 9/11 pushed the US and its allies to act decisively. Saddam's Iraq became the centerpiece of a new axis of evil, a threat demanding swift removal. By late 2006, Saddam was found guilty by the Iraqi Special Tribunal for ordering the massacre of 148 Shiites in Dujail back in 1982, a grim act of retaliation after an assassination attempt. Sentenced to death, he spent his final days under heavy guard, steadfast and defiant. On the morning of Eid al-Adha, Saddam was led to the gallows, clutching a Quran. The execution was swift, yet chaotic, surrounded by jeering witnesses and masked guards, some shouting the name of Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, a symbol of Iraq's sectarian divide. Before the trapdoor dropped, Saddam exchanged heated words with his captors. His final act was reciting the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, cut short by the snap of the noose and a neck breaking with a crack. The execution sent shockwaves across Iraq and beyond. For many Shiite Iraqis, it was justice served. For others, especially Sunnis, it was a humiliation that deepened sectarian wounds. The leaked cell phone video showing the taunts and turmoil only fueled anger and controversy. Saddam's body was flown back to his hometown near Tikrit, buried quietly among family. Yet the country he once ruled was anything but peaceful. His death signaled not the end of violence, but a painful new chapter marked by sectarian conflict and insurgency. And what happened next would prove just how fragile Iraq's future remained, and how the ghosts of Saddam's rule still haunted the nation. But if you think this was intense, wait until you hear what happened to the next dictator on our list.
For more than 4 decades, he ruled Libya with flamboyance and fear. But tonight, after months on the run, Muammar Gaddafi is dead.
October 20th, 2011, near Sirte, Libya. A battered, bloodied Muammar Gaddafi is dragged from a drainage pipe by revolutionaries, ending 42 years of brutal rule. The man who once called his enemies rats is now found hiding in filth, a hunted dictator whose time has finally run out. For months, Gaddafi had eluded capture as his regime crumbled, but on that fateful morning, he made a desperate escape attempt from Sirte, his hometown and final stronghold. At dawn, Gaddafi, loyalists, and his defense minister attempted to flee in a heavily armed convoy of about 50 vehicles. Their plan failed almost immediately. NATO drones and warplanes struck the convoy, destroying vehicles and scattering survivors. The chaos forced Gaddafi and his inner circle to abandon their vehicles and seek shelter in nearby abandoned villas. There, they endured relentless shelling from advancing anti-Gaddafi forces. Eventually, Gaddafi and a handful of loyalists made a final, desperate crawl through drainage pipes beneath a major highway, hoping to escape detection just a few hundred meters from the highway. But fate caught up with the dictator. Revolutionaries quickly discovered the group hiding in the culvert. As they approached, one of Gaddafi's bodyguards threw a grenade that tragically bounced back, killing the defense minister and wounding Gaddafi himself. What followed was chaos, captured on dozens of cell phones and broadcast around the world. The footage shows Gaddafi, already bleeding from shrapnel wounds, being dragged from the pipe, beaten, and abused by the angry crowd. Revolutionaries shout, "Allahu Akbar" and "Misrata" as they punch and kick the fallen leader. At one point, Gaddafi is stabbed with a bayonet, a wound that would later be confirmed by medical examiners. In the midst of the chaos, Gaddafi is loaded onto the hood of a pickup truck, blood streaming down his face. Some fighters shout to keep him alive, but the mob's rage is uncontrollable. Gunshots ring out. The exact moment of his death remains unclear, but by the time he's placed in an ambulance, Gaddafi appears lifeless. This was no peaceful transition of power. The revolutionaries' anger, fueled by decades of oppression, torture, and murder, exploded in those final moments. Gaddafi, who once promised to chase down cockroaches and rats inch by inch, now met a violent end in a drainage pipe, his body displayed for all to see. But Gaddafi's death wasn't the only brutal act that day. Human Rights Watch later documented the execution of dozens of captured loyalists at the nearby Mahari Hotel. At least 53, possibly 66 prisoners, some with hands tied behind their backs, were found shot dead. These executions marked the largest documented killing of detainees by anti-Gaddafi forces during the conflict. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Gaddafi's body was transported to Misrata, where it was displayed publicly before being buried in a secret desert location. His son Mu'tasim, captured alive the same day, was later found dead under suspicious circumstances, suggesting execution while in custody. Despite evidence of war crimes on both sides, Libya's transitional authorities failed to investigate or prosecute those responsible. The new government, struggling to control various militias, turned a blind eye to revolutionary justice, setting a dangerous precedent for the rule of law in post-Gaddafi Libya. The footage of Gaddafi's final moments, bloodied, beaten, and abused, became a symbol of both revolutionary justice and the lawlessness that would follow. His execution, captured on countless cell phones, stands as a stark warning about the dangers of unrestrained vengeance and the challenges of post-revolutionary justice. But if you think this was brutal, what happened to the next dictator on our list will send shivers down your spine. September 9, 1990. In a dim, makeshift interrogation room somewhere in Monrovia, Liberia, the camera rolls as a brutal chapter in African history reaches its shocking climax. Samuel K. Doe, Liberia's first indigenous president, kneels before his captors, his face bloodied, his body trembling, and his white undergarments stained from the violence already inflicted. Prince Johnson, the rebel leader, sits calmly before him, sipping a Budweiser beer, while a young woman fans him. This isn't just a political coup, it's a public execution designed for maximum humiliation. Just a decade earlier, Doe had risen from humble beginnings, overthrowing the Americo-Liberian elite who had ruled Liberia for over a century. He seized power in a violent coup, promising reform, but instead delivering years of corruption and ethnic favoritism that fractured the nation. Now, that same pattern of brutality would come full circle, with Doe as the victim. As the video continues, Doe is interrogated about missing gold and state funds, millions that his regime allegedly siphoned from Liberia's coffers. His eyes dart between his captors, desperate yet resigned. The camera captures every moment as Johnson's men strip away any remaining dignity, slicing off Doe's ear while he's still conscious. Blood pours down his face, but the tape keeps rolling. The horrific footage, which would later air on British television, abruptly cuts to black after the initial torture. But witnesses describe the next 30 minutes as sickening, detailing how the rebels kept Doe alive just long enough to extract every ounce of information and humiliation. They toss water on his battered body, reviving him only to continue the torment. The once powerful dictator reduced to a begging, broken man. Outside, Liberia is already deep into a brutal civil war. Johnson's Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL, and Charles Taylor's forces fight for control, while the general population suffers. Doe's execution serves both as retribution and warning, broadcast to the world as a symbol of changing power. By September 10th, news spread of Doe's death. His mutilated body, put on public display, becomes a grim trophy of the rebel victory. The violence doesn't end with his execution. Instead, it sets a precedent for the brutality that will consume Liberia for years to come. Johnson briefly claims leadership but is soon forced into exile as new factions rise. Remarkably, Prince Johnson would avoid prosecution for these atrocities. He claims to find religion, living as a born-again Christian in Nigeria before returning to Liberia and entering politics. By 2005, he won a Senate seat and later became a kingmaker in presidential elections, as his bloody past was seemingly forgotten by many. Ironically, the past of this next dictator can never be forgotten, as he was executed on Christmas Day. December 21st, 1989. In Bucharest's Revolution Square, Nicolae Ceaușescu stood before a massive crowd, delivering what would become his final public address. The atmosphere shifted suddenly as the chants of Timișoara, Timișoara erupted, drowning out his words and signaling the beginning of his end. For context, Ceaușescu, once a rising star in the Romanian Communist Party, had ruled Romania since 1965. He initially won praise for defying Soviet dominance and condemning the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. But over 2 decades, his regime spiraled into a brutal dictatorship marked by an oppressive secret police, economic hardship, and a cult of personality rivaling any in Eastern Europe. Economic policies obsessed with repaying foreign debt plunged the country into scarcity. Food, fuel, even basic heating were rationed. Meanwhile, Ceaușescu and his wife Elena lived in decadent palaces, epitomizing the divide between ruler and people. The famed Palace of the Parliament, still one of the largest buildings in the world, stands as a monument to this extravagance. The protests began in the city of Timișoara, sparked by the attempted eviction of a dissident pastor. Ceaușescu responded with violence, ordering the military to fire on demonstrators. This brutal crackdown ignited nationwide outrage and spread swiftly to the capital. As the unrest engulfed Bucharest, Ceaușescu's grip on power unraveled. On December 22nd, he and Elena fled the Central Committee headquarters by helicopter, a desperate escape attempt that failed when they were captured near Târgoviște. Their downfall was swift. A hastily organized military tribunal charged them with genocide and economic sabotage. Despite Ceaușescu's defiant denials, the verdict was certain. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were executed by firing squad. Their execution was broadcast on Romanian television, a shocking, raw spectacle that signaled the violent end of one of Eastern Europe's most repressive regimes. The trial, lasting barely an hour, was controversial, criticized for its speed and fairness. Yet many Romanians saw it as a necessary act to halt the chaos gripping the nation. In the aftermath, Romania began a difficult transition. The wounds of the revolution ran deep. Over 1,100 people were killed, and many more were injured or imprisoned. Even decades later, families still seek justice for loved ones lost in those turbulent days. But if you think this was intense, wait until you hear what happened to another dictator who faced the firing squad on camera. June 1st, 1946. Just outside the walls of Jilava prison, Ion Antonescu, the former conductor of Romania, stands before a firing squad. The once mighty marshal who led his country through World War II now faces justice for war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. His execution marks the end of an era, a brutal chapter in Romanian history that would haunt the nation for decades. But before that fateful morning, Antonescu's rise to power followed a calculated and relentless path. Born in 1882 to a military family in Pitești, he quickly distinguished himself as a formidable, if difficult, young officer. His ruthlessness during the 1907 peasant revolt earned him the ominous nickname Red Dog, and a reputation for severity that only grew during his service in World War I. As Chief of Staff for General Constantin Prezan, Antonescu's tactical brilliance helped save Romania from complete occupation, while his personal animosities, for the monarchy and minorities alike, began to fester. By 1940, Romania was reeling. The loss of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina to the Soviet Union, coupled with the cession of Transylvania to Hungary and Dobruja to Bulgaria, left the country demoralized and vulnerable. King Karl II, desperate to maintain his collapsing regime, appointed Antonescu prime minister, hoping his military credibility would restore order. Instead, within 48 hours, Antonescu forced Karl's abdication, reducing the new King Michael I to a powerless figurehead and assuming dictatorial control as conducator. Antonescu quickly allied Romania with Nazi Germany, drawn by promises of territorial restoration and economic support. The infamous National Legionary State brought the fascist Iron Guard into government, an uneasy partnership that exploded into violence and ended with Antonescu crushing the Guard in 1941. From that moment, his regime became one of Hitler's most loyal allies. Under Antonescu's rule, Romania joined Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, hoping to regain lost territories. The initial victories in Bessarabia and Bukovina fed nationalistic pride, but Antonescu's ambitions didn't stop at the old borders. He committed Romanian troops far beyond the Prut River, deeper into Soviet territory, dragging the country into a catastrophic alliance with the Axis. This loyalty came at a horrific price. Antonescu's regime orchestrated the mass murder of between 280,000 and 380,000 Jews, along with thousands of Roma and other minorities. The pogroms, deportations to Transnistria, and the Odessa massacre stand as some of the most brutal chapters of the Holocaust. Unlike other Axis partners, Romania's genocide frequently operated independently of German control, driven by local anti-Semitism and Antonescu's own virulent hatred. As the war turned against the Axis, Antonescu's grip weakened. The disaster at Stalingrad cost Romania 2 entire armies, shattering public support and exposing German contempt for their Latin allies. By 1944, with the Red Army approaching, Antonescu's desperate attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies failed. On August 23, 1944, King Michael's coup, backed by democratic parties and the underground communist movement, ended his dictatorship. Antonescu was arrested and handed over to Soviet authorities. At his trial before the Romanian People's Tribunal in May 1946, Antonescu faced charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggressive war. The evidence was overwhelming: documented massacres, deportations, and forced labor programs. Antonescu defended his actions as national defense, but the court saw through his rationalizations. The verdict: death by firing squad. June 1, 1946, dawned gray and damp. At the execution site, ironically called Valea Piersiților, or Valley of the Peach Trees, Antonescu refused a blindfold, raising his hat in salute as the order was given. The shots rang out, ending the life of a man whose crimes rivaled the worst of the Nazi era. But Antonescu's legacy didn't die with him. In the chaotic aftermath of World War II and the rise of communism, his memory became a battleground. Some Romanians, fueled by nationalist myths and anti-communist sentiment, attempted to rehabilitate his image as a patriot who defended Romanian interests. Others, especially survivors of his regime's atrocities, fought to preserve the truth about his crimes. Regardless, the next story on our list reveals how another dictator's downfall would reshape not just a nation, but an entire continent. October 15, 1944. Hungary plunges deeper into chaos as Ferenc Sz&aacute takes power amid the crumbling Axis front. The Arrow Cross Party's brutal campaign begins. Martial law, violent purges, and renewed deportations of Jews in the very heart of Europe's devastation. Sz&aacute wasn't just any dictator. A former Austro-Hungarian army officer, he transformed from a respected major to a fierce fascist leader obsessed with restoring Hungary's greater borders and enforcing a brutal nationalist ideology called Hungarism. His political rise was marked by virulent anti-Semitism and ruthless tactics. By late 1944, Germany's grip on Hungary tightened as Soviet forces advanced. Regent Miklos Horthy tried to pull Hungary out of the war, but the Nazis struck back, kidnapping Horthy's son and forcing him to abdicate under duress. This paved the way for Sz&aacute's puppet government, fully aligned with Nazi Germany, to take control. Sz&aacute's regime lasted only 163 days, but in that short time, his Arrow Cross militias terrorized Budapest. They were responsible for the massacre of thousands of Jews and for sending hundreds of thousands more to death camps. Martial law was harsh, dissent crushed without mercy, and Hungary became a dark outpost of Nazi brutality. As Soviet and Romanian troops surrounded Budapest in November 1944, Sz&aacute fled the capital, abandoning the city as the siege of Budapest began. By early 1945, he was on the run, first in Vienna, then Munich, escaping the collapse of his fascist dream. Captured by American forces in May 1945, Sz&aacute was brought back to Hungary to face justice. The People's Tribunal convicted him of war crimes and high treason. On March 12, 1946, Ferenc Sz&aacute was executed by hanging in Budapest. His brutal reign ended, but never forgotten. His execution was grim, bound, noosed, and left to die slowly by strangulation. Before his death, Sz&aacute received the last rites, a haunting end to the man who had dragged Hungary into one of its darkest chapters. But if you think this was a swift justice, the tangled politics of post-war Hungary would soon reveal even more brutal reckonings ahead. But next, we move to a dictator whose fall was just as dramatic, yet utterly different. May 22, 1946. In the courtyard of Pankrak Prison, Prague, Karl Hermann Frank faced the final act of his brutal reign, execution by hanging. Over 5,000 people came to witness the fall of one of the most feared Nazi leaders in Bohemia and Moravia. Frank wasn't just any Nazi official. Born in 1898 in Carlsbad, he rose from a bookseller and university student to become the ruthless Secretary of State and the top SS and police leader in the Protectorate. He masterminded terror, overseeing the Gestapo and SD operations that crushed resistance and oppressed Czech citizens mercilessly. His name became infamous after the Lidice massacre. In 1942, following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, Frank ordered the destruction of the village of Lidice, murdering all men, deporting women to concentration camps, and sending children to be Germanized or killed. It was a chilling message meant to drown rebellion in a sea of blood, as Frank himself had promised over the radio. Frank's power peaked when he became Minister of State for Bohemia and Moravia in 1943, wielding almost unlimited authority under the Nazi regime. He led brutal anti-partisan operations, attempting to crush resistance fighters with ruthless efficiency, but the fighters persisted. When the war ended, Frank surrendered to the U.S. Army on May 9, 1945. Extradited to Czechoslovakia, he was swiftly tried by the Extraordinary People's Court. The verdict was clear: guilty of war crimes, responsible for atrocities that stained history. The execution itself was public, one of the last in Prague's history, and was filmed for newsreels. Witnesses described the crowd's reaction as frenzied, a mix of relief and grim satisfaction. The executioner broke Frank's neck with his hands, a brutal end for a brutal man. Karl Hermann Frank was buried in an unmarked grave, but his legacy remains a stark reminder of the horrors of Nazi occupation and the justice that followed. His story is one of power abused and a reckoning that could not be ignored. Let's now move on to the next dictator whose execution shocked the world. September 27, 1996. Kabul wakes to the thunder of Taliban tanks rolling through its streets. The city, battered by years of civil war, now faces new rulers who waste no time making their presence known. Their first act, a brutal display meant to signal the dawn of a new era and the horrifying end of the old. Mohammad Najibullah, Afghanistan's former president, had been a virtual prisoner in the United Nations compound for over 4 years. Once known as the Butcher of Kabul for his role during the Soviet-backed communist regime, Najibullah had witnessed his power crumble as the Mujahideen closed in on Kabul in 1992. His fall from power was swift, but his end would be even more shocking. As the Taliban swept through the city, witnesses reported that life seemed to return to normal in much of Kabul. Markets reopened, people cautiously returned to their homes, and the militia's tanks pulled back to side streets. But beneath this surface calm, a darker reality unfolded. Najibullah made a desperate call to the UN at 3 a.m., pleading for protection as his guards abandoned him. Before help could arrive, Taliban fighters stormed the compound. They didn't just kill him. According to multiple sources, Najibullah and his brother Shahpur Ahmadzai were brutally tortured before their deaths. Their mutilated bodies were then dragged through the streets of Kabul, an unmistakable message to anyone who dared defy the new regime. The Taliban strung up their bodies from a concrete traffic control post at the gates of the presidential palace. Thousands gathered to witness the gruesome spectacle. Nur Hakmal, a Taliban commander, declared, "We killed him because he was the murderer of our people." Despite the carnage, the Taliban claimed they were not out for revenge. A commander known only as Musa stated that an amnesty had been declared for government soldiers who surrendered. Yet, the reality on Kabul's streets told a different story, a story of brutality disguised as justice. With the city firmly under their control, the Taliban moved quickly to establish their authority. They announced an interim ruling council, declaring Afghanistan a completely Islamic state, where a complete Islamic system will be enforced. The message was clear. The old order was dead, and anyone who opposed the new regime would meet the same fate as Najibullah. The United Nations expressed deep dismay at the executions, but the world watched helplessly as the Taliban solidified their grip on power. Najibullah's death marked more than just the end of a former president. It signaled the beginning of a harsh new reality for Afghanistan, one that would shape the country's fate for decades to come. But we're not done here. April 1945. The smoke of war still filled the air as Benito Mussolini, Italy's infamous fascist dictator, attempted a desperate escape. His reign had left Italy battered, divided, and humiliated. But as Allied forces closed in and partisan resistance swept through northern Italy, Mussolini's days were numbered. The story of his final moments reads like a dramatic script, filled with betrayal, fear, and justice, meted out by those he once sought to crush. By late April, Mussolini had already been reduced to ruling a German puppet state in northern Italy after his initial regime collapsed in 1943. For nearly 2 years, he clung to power in the so-called Italian Social Republic, headquartered in the small town of Salo. But as Allied troops advanced from the south and partisan uprisings grew ever more violent, his control unraveled rapidly. On April 18th, Mussolini fled his residence in Gargnano and relocated to Milan, seeking an escape route. There, he hoped to negotiate with Archbishop Schuster of Milan, perhaps to broker a deal for safe passage or surrender. But the walls were closing in. On April 25th, as resistance movements seized control in cities across northern Italy, Mussolini's position became hopeless. He briefly considered a final stand in the Valtellina Valley, the so-called Republic of the Alps. But with most of his supporters gone or in hiding, it was a fantasy. That evening, his last attempt at negotiation failed. At 8 p.m., he quietly slipped out of Milan, heading north toward Lake Como. His destination remained unclear, either the Swiss border or one last desperate redoubt in the mountains. Either way, he traveled in disguise, hoping to avoid detection by the partisans who now controlled the roads. The next day, Mussolini and his mistress, Claretta Petacci, joined a retreating German convoy, their hope to cross safely into Switzerland. But partisan forces, led by Pier Luigi Bellini della Stelle and Urbano Lazzaro, recognized one of the convoy's Italian fascist officers near the village of Dongo on Lake Como. They stopped the convoy, forcing the Germans to surrender all Italians in their ranks in exchange for safe passage. Mussolini, disguised and slumped in the back, was soon discovered. As Lazzaro, one of his captors, later recalled, "His face was like wax and his stare glassy but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion, but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead." In Dongo, Mussolini reunited with Petacci before both were taken to a local barracks. Over 50 fascist leaders and family members were arrested with them. The next morning, fearing rescue attempts by remaining loyalists, partisans moved the pair to the De Maria family farmhouse, where they spent what would be their final hours. At dawn on April 28th, a decision was made. Whether the order came from Milan's communist leadership, the National Liberation Committee, or local partisan commanders remains debated. But the message was clear: Benito Mussolini must die. Walter Audisio, using the pseudonym Colonnello Valerio, was dispatched to carry out the execution. He was joined by Aldo Lampredi to ensure the order was followed. That afternoon, Audisio and Lampredi arrived at the farmhouse. They loaded Mussolini and Petacci into a car and drove south to the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. There, in front of the Villa Belmonte, at approximately 4:10 p.m., both were shot. The details of those final seconds remain contested. Some accounts claim Mussolini begged to be shot in the chest. Others describe him as silent and resigned. What's certain, the man who once proclaimed himself Il Duce, the leader of Italy, died not on a grand stage but against a nondescript villa wall. But in death, Mussolini's degradation was just beginning. That evening, his body, along with Petacci's and other executed fascists, was loaded into a van and driven to Milan. At dawn on April 29th, they were dumped in the Piazzale Loreto, a square where 15 partisans had been executed the previous year. For hours, a mob gathered. The corpses were spat on, kicked, shot at, and urinated upon. Mussolini's face was battered beyond recognition. Eventually, the bodies were hung upside down from the metal framework of a half-built service station, a medieval humiliation reserved for traitors and tyrants. The gruesome display sent shockwaves through Europe. Adolf Hitler, upon hearing the news, reportedly accelerated his own suicide plans, determined not to face similar public humiliation. On April 30th, he shot himself in his Berlin bunker, instructing his body to be burned immediately. Mussolini's remains began a strange post-mortem journey. Initially buried in an unmarked grave, his body was stolen by fascist loyalists in 1946, hidden in various locations for months, and finally recovered by authorities. For 11 years, his corpse was kept in secret at a Capuchin monastery, before finally being interred in the family crypt in Predappio in 1957. Today, his tomb remains a pilgrimage site for neo-fascists, who mark the anniversary of his death with rallies and marches, proof that his legacy, though diminished, still casts a shadow. The official version of Mussolini's death, accepted outside Italy but long disputed within, attributes the execution to Audisio. However, alternative theories abound. Some claim British involvement, others suggest different executioners or earlier deaths. Over a dozen individuals have claimed responsibility for Mussolini's death at various times. But the essential facts remain. Benito Mussolini, the man who dragged Italy into darkness, met his end not as a grand leader, but as a broken fugitive, executed by those he once ruled, his corpse defiled by the very people he once held in terror. And now, it's time for the last dictator on our list. October 6, 1981, Cairo, Egypt. The annual military parade celebrating Egypt's victory in the 1973 Yom Kippur War had just begun. President Anwar Sadat, flanked by senior officials and foreign dignitaries, stood at the reviewing stand as soldiers marched past in perfect formation. The air was thick with anticipation. Above, Egyptian Air Force jets roared overhead in a carefully choreographed flyover, their thunder drowning out the chatter of the crowd. In that moment, no one suspected that beneath the surface of the celebration, a deadly plot was already in motion. As the parade continued, a military truck approached the reviewing stand. Lieutenant Khalid al-Islambouli, wearing his officer's uniform, forced the driver to stop at gunpoint. In seconds, he and his fellow conspirators leapt from the vehicle, weapons drawn. Sadat mistakenly believed it was part of the show, standing to salute the men. 3 grenades were hurled toward the president. Only one detonated, but fell short. The assassins opened fire, spraying the reviewing stand with automatic rifle fire. Chaos erupted as bullets tore through the crowd. Chairs were hastily thrown around Sadat in a desperate attempt to shield him. The attack lasted just 2 minutes, but the destruction was catastrophic. Sadat and 10 others were killed or fatally wounded, including senior military officials, a Cuban ambassador, and a Coptic Orthodox bishop. 28 more, including Vice President Hosni Mubarak and foreign dignitaries, suffered serious injuries. Security forces, momentarily stunned, responded within 45 seconds. Egyptian state television, broadcasting the parade live, abruptly cut to military music and Quranic recitations. The assassins were quickly captured, 1 killed, 3 wounded, and arrested. Sadat was rushed by helicopter to a military hospital. Despite efforts to save him, the president succumbed to his wounds 2 hours later. The official cause of death: violent shock and massive internal bleeding from torn chest organs. The assassination sent shockwaves through the Arab world, while some governments cheered Sadat's demise, viewing him as a traitor for signing peace with Israel. Others recognized the profound destabilization his death would cause. Syria's state newspaper called it the ultimate traitor's farewell, while Iran renamed a street after al-Islambouli. In the immediate aftermath, insurrection erupted in Upper Egypt. Rebels held security headquarters for 2 days, killing dozens of police and soldiers before government forces regained control. Most militants received surprisingly light sentences, serving only 3 years in prison. Sadat's funeral drew international attention. 3 former U.S. presidents attended: Nixon, Ford, and Carter, along with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and numerous world leaders. Sitting President Ronald Reagan, recently surviving his own assassination attempt, sent high-level representatives instead. The murder investigation quickly identified Lieutenant al-Islambouli's cell within the Egyptian military. The plot traced back to radical Islamist groups furious over Sadat's peace treaty with Israel. Their careful planning included stockpiling weapons and recruiting military officers sympathetic to their cause. Within months, the assassins faced trial and swift justice. On April 15, 1982, the 2 army men were executed by firing squad, while the 3 civilian conspirators faced hanging. Sadat's death marked the end of an era for Egypt. His vice president, Hosni Mubarak, assumed power and ruled for nearly 30 years. The state of emergency declared after Sadat's murder remained in effect for decades. Today, Sadat is buried at Cairo's Unknown Soldier Memorial, the inscription reading simply, "The Hero of War and Peace." His assassination stands as one of the most dramatic political killings ever captured on camera, an event that forever changed the course of Middle Eastern history.